When talking about what F.E.A.R could have been, I do worry I may fall into the trap a lot of people do when talking about their favourite media, chasing that high, and unable to accept it for being a product of a perfect time, place, people, and circumstances that led to its creation, a lightning in a bottle. Oh, if only we get this developer back. Oh, if only we get this team to come back. Oh, this guy, he'll know what to do, he'll get the franchise back on track. Desperately trying to recreate the conditions or just re-rolling the dice, hoping for a good result. No, just let it go, it's done. If that magic does happen again, it'll be at an unexpected day from an unexpected place, just like the first time. I do wonder if I fall into that same trap with F.E.A.R. Maybe it was lightning in a bottle, but I do think it was more of a lightning in a battery, something that still has potential if only it was handled differently. I mean, Extraction Point kinda proved that. The basic premise of a special forces team specifically trained to combat the paranormal and supernatural is something that can be expanded on and experimented with, like an anthology series. With F.E.A.R 1 we had J-horror and a creepy ghost girl and other paranormal entities, mixed with a militarized psychic clone army to fight against, but imagine what else could have been done. How about a cult in small town America trying to summon a satanic deity? Were you trying to fight off the creatures of the night and cultists, some of which have wormed their way into law enforcement and planted themselves throughout the town? Or how about a secret society of vampires engaging in political espionage, with them puppeteering terrorist and extremist groups to distract from themselves while subverting everyone behind the scenes? Or how about a company experimenting with phase technology and alternate dimensions, in which monsters are leaking in from those other dimensions into ours? That last idea may have rang a bell, but this was the original concept for F.E.A.R 3, before these ideas were cannibalized into the final version. Yes, the F.E.A.R project that Day One Studios worked on, that was supposed to be F.E.A.R 2 but eventually became F.E.A.R 3, was actually going to be more of an anthology entry, with a new cast and location, away from Alma and Fairport. That changed when Monolith were able to get the rights back of the F.E.A.R name, which restarted production, and the project only got mishandled and mismanaged from there. There's a set of interviews with a few devs that worked on F.E.A.R 3, going into detail on their views and experiences working on the project, along with some of the ideas they originally had for their F.E.A.R 2. I'm not going to cover everything in these interviews, so I've linked it down below. I highly recommend checking out the video yourself. Day One's F.E.A.R 2 was going to be inspired from the Philadelphia experiment, where a company, possibly Armacham or one of its offshoots, were dicking around with phase technology for their soldiers, causing creatures from alternate realities to start leaking into our world. It was up to a new F.E.A.R team to go in and handle the situation, dealing with the phase soldiers and the supernatural threat. That is what the original plan was before Monolith got the rights to the name back. Since their project's origin became F.E.A.R 2, Warner Brothers wanted this game to be a more direct follow-up, so Day One Studios restarted production with them bringing back Point Man, who fled the United States to go into hiding in South America, where most of the game was going to take place. Yeah, this is why the final version of F.E.A.R 3 starts here. They'd already spent a ton of time making assets and levels for this location. But this is where publisher interference really started causing problems, because the president of Warner Brothers Interactive Entertainment at the time, Martin Tremblay, became, and I quote, enamored with Call of Duty. I mean, that sums up pretty fucking well, doesn't it? The South America location changed for a more urban locale because, you guessed it, Call of Duty had big city maps. There needed to be a bigger focus on spectacle and big events because, you guessed it, Call of Duty had big spectacle moments in Modern Warfare 2. The scoring system was also mandated by the publisher, along with co-op, which I bet money were also influenced by Call of Duty. Co-op in particular had a big impact on the game's development since it was going to be single player throughout most of the project. Entire levels now had to be retooled and restructured to support functionality for 2 players, along with scrapping the scared toolbox system, a system intended for the horror of the game that had to be dropped because it wasn't going to work for 2 players and it wasn't viable to get it to work before launch. All this fuckery behind the scenes had a huge impact on the developers, as you may have guessed. A negative atmosphere formed within the studio, with tensions brewing and team members often turning on one another, shooting down ideas and suggestions. The project suffered with huge crunch time. They had on and off crunches during development, along with an 8-month crunch period of 60 to 80 hour weeks leading to the launch of the game. The special thanks segment in F.E.A.R 3's credits are mostly made up of developers who left during the production due to the work conditions thrusted on them. I actually want to bring up some interesting people who worked on the game, something I've aggressively left out of my review, and that was the presence of John Carpenter and Steve Niles, or lack of it.
I have been waiting to talk to somebody about those two idiots.
Yeah, these two big names apparently worked on F.E.A.R 3 and were part of the marketing at the time. The marketing and not much else according to the dev team. John was a no-show, never showing up to the offices and only really gave notes to the team. Steve had a bit more of an input, but was constantly late on his work and held up the team. Some developers even said John and Steve actually hindered the project rather than helped, all of it being just a PR stunt. Day One Studios really got railed hard. They were on this F.E.A.R project since 2006, a year after F.E.A.R 1 got released, and were pretty much working on it non-stop, only for most of it being thrown away, since Warner Brothers really didn't seem to know what to do with F.E.A.R or Day One Studios, evident by them constantly changing gears and mandating random features, and unfortunately, it was the devs that got hit with the work. I do think the overly common narrative these days of publisher bad, developer good is a bit of a naive take. I mean, just go look at Anthem. But in this instance, it really was a complete fuck up on behalf of the publisher. That being said, I don't think the developer's vision for their F.E.A.R 2 may have worked well for a sequel for F.E.A.R 1. They'd probably be better off as a spin-off or even just an original franchise. It just didn't look like F.E.A.R, something they themselves said. They took the original core of the game and ran a bit too far with it, but they did have some original ideas, something that I can't say for Monolith's F.E.A.R 2. The more I think about F.E.A.R 2, the more I find myself frustrated with it. This was the original team that made the first game, and going by the past interviews, it seemed like they were eager to get back into it. But they somehow just rehashed most of the story and downgraded nearly everything from F.E.A.R 1 to the second game. Not much is known behind the scenes with Monolith at this time, but if the accounts of Day One Studios are anything to go by, I wouldn't be surprised if there was mismanagement and meddling here too by Warner Brothers. Honestly, Warner Brothers doesn't get nearly the shit that they deserve. I don't know why, but despite my harsh review of the game, and even thinking I went too soft in some segments when looking back, I still have a bit of a subjective fondness for F.E.A.R 2. It's not an, oh, it could have been better if it was something different, because you can really say that about anything, but I think some minor changes behind the scenes and priorities could have left F.E.A.R 2 being good. It's just a missed opportunity and wasted potential. Although looking at each entry in the series, we could be seeing things backwards. I think the difficulties with trying to follow up from the first game actually stem from F.E.A.R 1 itself, with this event. This may have fought the series harder than Alma fought Beckett. I mean, how do you follow up from this? Every game aside from the third revolved around this one event. You're pretty much railroaded into a direct follow-up like Extraction Point or F.E.A.R 2, and both those games struggled with their story. XP was lacking much of a story at all, while F.E.A.R 2 spent most of its runtime retelling the first games like a soft reboot. And why did they both struggle? Well, F.E.A.R 1 was a complete story narratively. The replica situation resolved, Alma's mystery was uncovered, nearly everything was wrapped up, but then ends on a huge cliffhanger of an event that couldn't be ignored. They really fucked themselves here. F.E.A.R 1 should have ended with Point Man just leaving, no big explosion. Alma could have been left ambiguous, with the option to return later down the line. In fact, the series' obsession with Alma and ATC is something that started to grate on me as I got further into the franchise. It obviously makes sense in F.E.A.R 1, and Alma's focus was appropriate for XP, but F.E.A.R 2 drags these two out again for no good reason, and F.E.A.R 3 digs up their already beaten corpses. It makes this whole world feel like it revolves completely around Alma and ATC, with nothing else happening or reacting to them. It's something even Perseus Mandate did better. It actually felt like there were other things going on outside the events in the first game, with you feeling those ramifications, but you still got your own adjacent story going on. Hell, in F.E.A.R 1 itself you had those news reports on the radio, detailing an outside perspective on the events in the game.
We have an update on the situation at Armacham headquarters. A company spokesperson has confirmed that many employees were still at work when the situation first erupted.
F.E.A.R 2 and 3 felt like complete tunnel vision narratively. When looking back, I'm surprised how the expansions for F.E.A.R 1 came out as well as they did. Don't get me wrong, Perseus Mandate has issues, but considering Timegate were thrown into the deep end, Extraction Point has no right being as good as it was. I think given the circumstances, it was as good as it could have been. It built on the strengths of the base game and remedied some of the issues. The only problem with XP was the story, which, as mentioned, was limited in what they could do coming off the ending of the base game, so the devs basically just winged it. Although given the reception the series gets, I don't think that many people care for F.E.A.R's narrative, so this blemish slips through the cracks for most people. Perseus' mandate was a bit more of a stumble. It tried to experiment with the gameplay of the base game, but clearly didn't have the time to achieve what they wanted, and it really shows. Maybe if they had an extra year in the oven, and maybe more assistance from Monolith with the engine, they could have made something close to XP in quality, but with its own spin. After reviewing the games and looking back, surprisingly, the story of Perseus' mandate grew on me. After dealing with Alma and ATC non-stop, having PM adding something new to the mix at least piques an interest, actually expanding the world and giving a little taste of what an anthology entry may have looked like. Now to be clear, I'm not glazing this and saying it's actually secretly great and misunderstood. The narrative doesn't make any sense as detailed in my review, but it does have a glimmer of adding something new instead of constantly retreading the same old shit. But this got me thinking. We've seen what Monolith or Warner Brothers did with their games, but what if we had a continuation of Vivendi's timeline, a third expansion pack, or a sequel made by Timegate? What about a cleanup of Fairport, with F.E.A.R teams all across the country conversing on the city, since it was such a catastrophic event, with then combating the reactivated replica, the covert Nightcrawlers who were still up to no good, and a paranormal threat infesting the vacant city. The game can lean way more into exploring the paranormal side of the world, and how F.E.A.R would tackle situations like this but on a scale that they've never seen before, along with some backstabbing from the Senator and what's left of ATC, much less direct than the other timeline. Just something I pulled out my ass, but at least it's more original than what Monolith did. So, where are we now with the franchise? A franchise that only had 1.5 absolute banger games from 20 years ago, with its last entry from over 10 years ago. I nevertheless think that core of F.E.A.R is still strong. Action inspired by John Woo films and The Matrix, with a horror element laid on top. But even if there was a new F.E.A.R game, I really don't have much hope for it. I think the lightning that they caught in the battery has long since discharged. It's such a shame as well. It definitely doesn't seem like it today, but when F.E.A.R 1 released it was shoulder to shoulders with the likes of Half-Life 2 and Doom 3. For reference, F.E.A.R 1 sold over 3 million copies around when it came out. Compare that to Doom 3 with 3.5 million sales around the time it launched, along with Half-Life 2 selling around 4 million in its first 2 years. F.E.A.R was really up there. But Half-Life 2 continued to sell, with its expansions, mod support and garage mod exploding in popularity. It hit 15 million back in 2011, with estimates of nearly 30 million today. Doom took a break for a while, but returned in 2016 with 3.6 million in sales that year, and has only continued since then. F.E.A.R just got forgotten. There were talks of a F.E.A.R movie being made a few times, with it last mentioned in 2018, but every time it fell through. Even in the gaming space today, F.E.A.R really doesn't have much recognition, but for an audience of moviegoers, I just don't see how it could work, unless they make a John Wick with a horror twist. Honestly, that doesn't sound bad, but they'd fuck it up, they always do. The only thing I want from F.E.A.R now is for those old beta builds to be uncovered. I would love to deep dive into them and see the stuff that got cut. I know this was more of a short rambly video and a bit all over the place, but I still had some thoughts on the series that didn't really fit in my reviews. What about you? I know this is usually a lazy YouTuber thing to get more comments, but I am curious what other people's thoughts are on the franchise and what it could have been. Or were you happy with what they did do with the games? Actually, while I'm here, rest in peace Jim Ward, the voice of Bettis in F.E.A.R and many other characters across media. He passed away on the 10th of December 2025, only 2 weeks before Christmas. I would have included it in my F.E.A.R 3 review, but I legitimately didn't know until last week. Absolutely gutted. While I'm doing condolences, I'll also mention Udo Kirsper, who passed away the 23rd of November 2025. I mainly know him as Yuri from Red Alert 2, another of my all-time favourite games, one from my childhood. Absolutely gutted about his passing too. Man, what a shitty way to end the year. I don't want to end the video on such a downer. Not that I think it will help, but I've got a new review series coming out that actually has more than one good game this time. Anyway, I hope you all had a good Christmas and New Year's. That's all for now, I'll see you again.